Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. Good evening. We're welcome. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're here. Thank you. So, let me take care of, I'm going to welcome us to this time. Let me take care of a bit of housekeeping that you probably have some interest in. You notice that we did not scan on the way in. And one of the reasons we did not scan on the way in is because everyone needs to get scanned. This isn't about convocation credit. This is about class credit. So we will scan you on the way out, and we just want you to know that. That's the process this time. And tomorrow we'll switch back to scanning on the way in. We just didn't want to miss anybody in that process. All right, so here we are. We're getting started telling the story of God's work in the world. And the idea of these few days, to borrow from a book that you'll see tonight, is to connecting your work, our idea, how we think about work, connecting your work to God's work. That's what these few days are about. That's what these few days are about. So we will hear from 4 speakers across a couple of days. Tonight, tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening, and Wednesday afternoon, we'll hear from 4 people who will tell that story to us. And then there will be a series of workshops that you will also attend that will then get into the nitty-gritty of what does it really look like to follow Christ into a particular part of life, a particular world, following a particular major, whatever that might be. That's what we'll do. The faculty have set those up, and we brought in a number of guests for that conversation as well. So, but before we get started, we have a bookseller. We have a resident bookseller during this time. We bring a bookseller in from Pennsylvania. Byron and Beth Borger run Hearts and Minds Bookstore. Those of you here last time, remember the bookstore? The books, yes. And I got to tell you, this is unlike any other Christian bookstore, if it's okay to say that. It's really true. It's a bookstore that takes the life of the mind seriously. It's a bookstore that takes the complexities of life. Christian bookstore that takes the complexities of life seriously. So Byron Borger, Beth Borger, they load up a truck, they come down here. I'm going to introduce Byron. He's going to come at the beginning of every main session and introduce some resources to us so that you can keep this conversation going for yourself beyond these few days. So come on up, Byron.
Thank you, Montreat College. I am so excited to be back here again. I was here 2 years ago when you heard me preach way too long. I promise I won't do that this year. At least I think I will. It's trick or treat though, so I could be lying. I will try not to go quite so long, but last year, man, it was just so exciting to be here because I've got so much to share with you from Pennsylvania. My wife and I have this bookstore down here, and there are books around all different kind of majors, most of them Christian, although some are not. We believe in reading widely, reading interesting things. I don't know where you all stand in your own faith journey, so there's something for everybody. Academic, serious stuff. There's stuff for faculty. And there's some kind of basic stuff for those that are just checking this whole story out. So we're pleased to have these resources here. It took us forever to box them up, to drive down here. I got stories to tell about the trip. That'll have to be later. But for tonight, I just want to let you know, everything's 20% off over there, so we're doing this discount thing. We take credit cards. You can, bill your mom. You can bill somebody else's mom. Bill Tom's mom, I think you could probably do. Anything we can do to get these books into your hands, we're excited about that, and we're here to help you and serve you. So we'll be here throughout the duration of the event. Let me tell you about some books just now that might be useful to get us going tonight. The first one is a real short little thing, and I know you're busy students, and you got papers to write and stuff, so I made this one short. But it is actually a small group Bible study, so you could pull some friends together, drink some coffee, chat about this together. It's the only book of its kind. It is called All Things New. It is by a guy named Hugh Welchel, who's a businessman, and Hugh put this little Bible study together to show the story that Montreat College lives and dies by. This creation, fall, redemption, and promise of restoration, these 4 chapters of the story that we're going to be hearing about over the next couple of days. This book does short little discussion questions around those things. So if that's a way of telling the gospel story that's sort of new to you, those 4 chapters in this little book will save your life. The next little chapter is called Why Does It Matter? So it fleshes out the implications of this story that you guys are working with. Now, if that excites you, as I hope it kind of will, and tonight we'll get it going as you hear the doctrine of creation explicated, you'll see, oh man, where this is going. The next book I want to tell you about, it's a little thicker, a little more serious, but it's really fun to read, I promise you. It's called Garden City, Work, Rest, and the Art of Being Human. It's by a guy named John Mark Comer. Has any of you have read this? Have any of you ever heard of this? It's really, really a good book. At that conference called Jubilee up in Pittsburgh, we sold a bundle of those this past year, and students have since come back to me, said it's one of the best books they've ever read. Designed for young adults, designed for collegiates, about thinking about work and rest and being human and why God is in the middle of all that stuff. Of course, you're doing it here to think about stuff. You got to not only just say God's in everything and God calls us to work, we got to flesh that out in our own majors and disciplines and careers, which is what you'll be doing in the workshops. This is just a small little booklet. I'm telling you, it'll rock your world. It is a very serious, great resource called Your Mind's Mission. It's by a guy named Greg Yao. It just tries to explain why we need to think better as Christians. And why, as people who are biblical people, we can't just go along with the world, but we got to think through the implications of the four-story gospel for every area of life. If your mind is a little tired, if you don't see the coherence in the university, if you wonder what this class has to do with that class, you want to learn to think better, to sort that out, this little booklet will get you started. The next book is the same kind of idea, but worked out for academic experiences in the university. It's almost the only book of its kind, Learning for the Love of God, A Student's Guide to Academic Faithfulness. Don Opitz was here 2 years ago with us. Derek Melleby co-wrote it. This book is designed to help college students when they're in Christian colleges or mainstream public universities to view their work in the university as worship. That you can find God in every academic discipline. Jamie Smith has a blurb in the back, a renowned philosopher, and he says, people should buy a box of these and give them to every college student you know. I don't know if people are doing that, but man, I wish some people would buy these and give them out to you guys. I wish we could afford to do that because it is a life-changing book. So you ought to buy a couple, you ought to read them with your friends. It is the Learning for the Love of God. And then lastly, you're going to hear tonight from a woman that I respect immensely, that I enjoy immensely, and she's a darn good writer and co-wrote a book with one of the most famous Christian writers of the 20th and 21st century, a guy named Timothy Keller. And to have your name with a Keller book and to help co-write with him is pretty great. Her name is Catherine Leary Alsdorf. You're going to be hearing from her shortly. And her book that she co-wrote with Tim is called Every Good Endeavor. It is the cream of the crop in the variety of books we have over there around faith and work and integrating the gospel story into the work world. If you care at all about your higher education, and that it's leading you to take up a career and a calling as a holy vocation, and you want to think that stuff through, this really can't get any better. It's one of the very, very best books of our time for this whole topic, Every Good Endeavor by Catherine Alsdorf. Thank you. We'll see you later.
So an additional guests that we will have in each of the 4 main sessions are the folks of Acts of Renewal. Jim Shores, Carol Anderson Shores, and they come to do theater to help tell the story. So please welcome Acts of Renewal.
Thank you. We are so honored to be here. You can see we dressed up for trick or treat. Do you have candy for us? And I'm Jim Shores.
And I'm Carol Anderson Shores.
Together we're Acts of Renewal.
And tonight we are going to start telling the story. In the beginning, God created what? The heavens and the earth. And he created out of his imagination, this amazing imagination, all that we see outside in this beautiful world around us, especially here in Montreat. And he saved the best for last because toward the end of the week there, he created us. Not only did he create us, it wasn't just out of his imagination, but he said, let us create mankind in our image. Male and female, let us create them. And so here we are, but it wasn't just like, bing, go off and do your own thing. No, we were created by a wonderful God who's passionately involved in our journey. In each of us, as we start our new beginning, our new creation of our life and journey along, he is involved and cares. And all the stuff about our work What's our career going to be? What is our calling? Can get kind of mysterious at times. And how do you figure that all out? Well, we're not alone. 70% of Scripture is narrative, and we've got lots of great stories and can kind of identify with some people who were struggling with some of the same questions when it came to calling. In fact, we like to look at one of those stories, and in Hebrews, it says about Abraham. It says, by faith, Abraham was called to go forth to a land he would later receive as an inheritance. And by faith, Abraham obeyed, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. So I wondered what that scene might have looked like in a scene from, I don't know, Abraham and Sarah's relationship. And so we're going to look at that in this piece entitled, Go. Are you sure he didn't mention an address? Like leave your father's house and go to a new city with a good water system. Like that new development they've got in East Mesopotamia. Now that would be a lovely place to move to.
He didn't give an address. He just said go.
Are you sure? It just seems to me if the Lord God knows all our needs, he'd have a nice house ready for us a few miles out of town. Nice view of the desert, not too close to the desert, if you know what I mean.
He didn't say anything about any of that. He just said go.
I'm just wondering if you missed a few details. You know, men, they think they're listening, but they don't always hear the whole story. Like last night, I was telling you about that argument Mitzvah had with her husband, and I said to you, are you listening to me? And you said, oh, right, cucumber.
What?
Cucumber. I was telling you how he hit her off the head with a cucumber, but that was much earlier in the story.
So?
Well, when I asked if you were listening, that was later in the story, when she was telling me how he never picks up his tunics. He just leaves them where they drop. He'd step over them before he'd bend down and pick up. Anyway, you weren't listening to that part at all. So I'm just wondering, are you sure that...
I remember every word the Lord God said to me. You have a different level of attention when God, who created the heavens and the earth, starts speaking to you and with a message like that.
All right. One more time. So we're supposed to leave here.
He said, leave your father's house and go to a land I will show you.
Where's the land?
He's going to show us.
When's he going to show us?
When we leave, when we're going.
Going where?
Where we're going.
Gosh, this is... Did he give you any kind of direction, like north, south, east, west?
No, just go.
You know, this takes a certain amount of trust.
Faith.
Faith. Yes, a lot of faith. I need to cancel my subscription to the Scroll of the Month Club. There's no way they're going to find us since we don't know where we're going.
You know, this isn't the first time God's asked somebody to do something new. I mean, just think of all the stories.
What stories?
The stories. I mean, think about Adam. He called him to name the animals.
So?
So, there's a lot of animals. I mean, how was he going to name all them? And how's he going to remember all their names? God didn't tell him how to do it. He just called him to do it.
Yeah?
Yeah. And then, Adam, he tells him, I want you to work and to tend the garden. I don't think he went through every little detail on how to do that.
Well, at least he knew where the garden was because he was standing in it.
That's not the point. The point, hey, think about Jubal. Jubal, he's the father of music. Everybody who wants to create music, he invents the lyre and the pipes. Do you think he knew exactly how to do this thing, this desire to make music? No, God had to lead him to that place of knowing what to do.
So what has that got to do with...
And think about Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain, first person to forge metals and bronze. Do you think he knew what to do with this thing that God had put in his heart that he needed to figure out?
Well, at least he got to figure it out in his own backyard.
That's not the point.
What is the point?
The point is, he called these people to do something new, and they responded.
Well, isn't that wonderful? But when it comes to us, we still have to... Oh. Yoo-hoo! In here, dear. It's Mitzvah. She's come for the pillows, and I told her we'd give her the couch. Well, there's no way we can balance that on a camel. Mitzvah, dear. Yeah, come here. I got your pillows for you right here. But listen, you're going to need a couple of your big grandsons to move that couch. There's no way you can pick up that thing on your own. Yes, we're leaving. Soon? Soon. Well, we're going in a good direction. out. Well, because Abram says that's what God told him to do. You see, Abram thinks we're going to need more room for all the children we're going to be having. Yes, I know I'm 65. That's a curious detail, that. But that's what God told him. He said he's going to be having children. But, I don't think that's going to be till we get where we're going, which is going to be a surprise. Of course we're going to say goodbye to you. We're going to say goodbye to everyone, but especially to you. Don't start. Don't start. You're going to get me going. Are we ever coming back here? We don't know. There's a few details a little hazy here, but I'm sure it will all work out. So you got the pillows, and thank you for the matzo balls. They were just delicious. I'll have that platter back to you before we go. She's my best friend.
I know.
I'm leaving my best friend.
We're taking my nephew, Lot.
Oh, that'll be fun. Oh, and that wife of his. I can never remember her name. You know, Lot's wife. She always does exactly the opposite of whatever you tell her to do. Oh, and the two of them together. Oh, won't this be an adventure?
It's gonna be all right. He's gonna bless us. He said he would bless me. He said he would bless you. He said he would make me into, he said that all of the earth is gonna be blessed through me.
You. I know, that's big. That's really big. But you gotta remember, you're the one he told this to. I wasn't there. You're the one who experienced this.
I pray that you will too.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, I have to obey what he tells me to do. And right now, the only direction I'm getting from him is through you. So it's like I need double faith. Faith in him and faith in you.
Look, I know this is huge. It's crazy. It makes no sense. But it was more than my ears that I heard his voice with, Sarai. It was in my heart. My soul, I felt the power of his presence, and I can't even find the words to describe it, but I know I have to obey what he's calling me to do.
Then I will too.
And we'll go.
We'll go. Not knowing where or how in the world at the age of 65 I'm going to have a baby.
Perhaps God has in mind a miracle.
Oh, can you think of a bigger miracle than having a baby at 65?
Having one at 66?
But no older.
It's gonna be all right. He's gonna be with us. He's gonna be with me. He's gonna be with you. And we're gonna take this journey together. And just think, we're gonna get to see, first thing, all of the things that he is going to do.
Then let's go.
Well, good evening. Good evening. I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker in our first of 4 plenary sessions. Our speaker tonight is Catherine Leary Alsdorf, and although I've just met her, I'm actually very, very excited to hear what she has to say. Her background is really compelling. Let me give you a brief introduction. We'll welcome her to stage to give some comments, and then when she's finished, I'll join her on stage and have some questions for Q&A, and then we will invite you, as we so often do, to join the Q&A. There'll be a text number up on the screen for you. But let me introduce our speaker. Catherine Leary Alsdorf is currently the Senior Fellow with Redeemer City to City, launching and directing a new City Fellows program here in North Carolina in the city of Raleigh. Catherine founded the Center for Faith and Work at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. If you don't know Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which where Tim Keller is a pastor that has become one of the bright lights in any metropolitan area in the world. Tim Keller has been pastor there for a number of years. He's written a number of books. If you're not familiar with Tim Keller, I really encourage you, YouTube, get some books. Byron will have some available in the bookstore in Fellowship Hall. That's a thinker and a writer and a Christian leader that I really want to encourage you to become very familiar with. She served as the founder of the Center for Faith and Work at Redeemer and served as the executive director of that center from 2002 to 2012. Some of her innovative programs include the Intensive Gotham Fellows and an entrepreneurship initiative to start new gospel-centered ventures, arts ministries, vocation groups, lecture series, and conferences. The center's mission is to equip, connect, and mobilize the church to fully apply the gospel to their work lives and become agents of renewal within their institutions and professions. Right up our alley for what we want to talk about these 2 or 3 days. From 1976 to 2002, before going to Redeemer, Catherine served in leadership roles in the high-tech industry in California, Luxembourg, and New York City. She was CEO of an online management education company, a hardware software products company, and a satellite services company. She earned her MBA at the University of Virginia's Darden School. She serves on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And in 2012, Christianity Today named Catherine one of their 50 women you should know. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Leary Alsdorf.
Thank you.
Welcome. Great to have you here.
In my next career, I want to do what those guys do. That was really great. That was really fun. So, in case you didn't pick up the clue, I'm here to talk about Genesis, the story of creation, the story of our origins. We think that's an important thing to do if you're trying to figure out your work life for when you get out of school. And it's an important thing to do if you just want to have a meaningful life. It makes sense, doesn't it? Some people, they look back at their genealogy. Why? They hope it will tell them something about themselves, like maybe why they have such a bad temper or why they're so good with woodworking. But even more basic than that, we typically don't pick up a book in the middle and read to the end and expect to understand the story. It's the first chapter that provides the interpretive structure for the entire story. The main character, the dilemma, the initiation of the plot line that then shapes the rest of the story. So to help you understand your story, we're going to look at Genesis. The title of the first book of the Bible, it comes from the Greek word that means origins. Personally, I discounted Genesis completely until I was about 40 years old. I went to a church as a kid, and I learned some of the basics, John 3:16 and the 23rd Psalm. But we never really talked much about Genesis, especially Genesis 1, 2, and 3. As I reached high school, I was actually quite embarrassed by it, especially in light of scientific learnings about evolution. And it was just easier to lop off those first few books of the Bible and ignore them. But as a result, I cut off the beginning of the story. And pretty soon, the middle and the end of the story weren't making much sense. And I walked away from the whole thing, the whole story and faith of Christianity, in search of a more enlightened way to figure out life. So I'm giving you the origins of my discovery of Genesis, and as a result, the discovery of God and a Savior that the whole story is about, in hopes that you'll start out your work life on a much firmer footing than I started out mine, and avoid 20 years of wandering in the wilderness that I went through. So I want to talk about 3 things. How to read Genesis, what Genesis has to say about who you are and the work you're to do, how to apply that right now to your work at college and the work as soon as you get out. So how do you read Genesis? My breakthrough that allowed me to see the profound importance of the first 3 chapters of Genesis happened just in the first couple years that I was re-exploring the Christian faith. God had awakened my interest and was starting to open my eyes and my ears to understand the Bible and the gospel. I happened on a class on Genesis in which the instructor talked about the historical context of the book. He explained some of the stories that were popular in its day, other creation stories like the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis. His main point was the creation story is not an apologetic against evolution. It's an apologetic against the creation stories of its day. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about those. The Enuma Elish story, it's from the region of Mesopotamia, the language of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, so it's contemporary with the Israelites during the time of the Old Testament. I won't go through the whole story, but it starts with the genealogy of all the gods and goddesses. Eventually, the gods and goddesses start fighting, and Marduk is the young hero god. And Tiamat is the senior woman goddess, and they go to war against each other. And the battle in this story is vividly described. At the climax of the conflict, Marduk somehow lets loose a wind that shoots an arrow into her mouth, tears open her belly, and extinguishes Tiamat's life. He then takes her body and splits it in 2 parts. With one half, he fashions the heavens, and the other half, he fashions the earth. After this, he decides to make human beings. And then he's very specific about their purpose. He says, I shall create humankind, and they shall bear God's burden so that the gods can rest. So to make them, Marduk kills the leader of Tiamat's army, and from his blood, he makes humanity. And after this, the rest of the gods are pretty happy with Marduk because they don't have to work anymore. So that's the Enuma Elish story. And there's a second Akkadian story, a little bit different, but it opens also at a time when only the gods exist. The conflict arises when the lower gods go on strike against the more powerful gods. The lower gods had been digging irrigation canals and were tired of their work. In response to their picketing, the birth goddess is then directed to build the first humans, and again, to bear the yoke. Let man assume the drudgery of the gods. To make that happen, she killed one of the lesser gods, mixed his blood with clay, and thereby produced humanity. So imagine, you're an early Israelite around the time of Moses, and you have a story that you're part of as the people of the one true God. You'd be writing this apologetic, this origin of the universe, as apologetic against these stories, not to provide some scientific explanation that we seek today, but to reveal something about the God you know, the God of the universe, why he made us, and who you are. There are some similarities. The way the world is formless before the story begins, they use the clay from the earth to make man, even that they both have to do with work right in the beginning. But there's also some profound differences. Just focus on 2. The creation process of these other Mesopotamian stories begin with conflict, war, revenge. There's nothing like that in the Genesis account. God shapes the watery mass into a beautifully ordered world over the course of 6 days of creation. There didn't need to be a conflict. The purpose of the Genesis creation text was to assert the truth about who and why creation happened. The second contrast is about how they talk about work. God didn't give Adam and Eve work to do so that he could get out of doing it. He gave them work to share in the glory of creation. and then be able to say, and it was good. They were cultivating in the glory of the garden. So the drudgery of work, which is obviously a very real thing, both in Mesopotamia and today, in our story didn't come about until Adam and Eve rebelled against sin. Drudgery wasn't God's plan. It was a result of sin. So how can we read Genesis? We need to read it as a literary story in its context of its historical background. And we need to reflect on what the author's trying to tell his audience, what he's trying to tell us about who God is and who we are in relation to him. This approach to Genesis took me off my focus on its accuracy in terms of scientific thinking and enabled me to enter into this story that spans across all time, beginning with God, his love children, and ending with his victory over sin and the coming of the new kingdom on earth at the end of Revelation. The second thing I want to talk about is then what Genesis has to say about who you are and the work you are to do. I think if we read Genesis 1 and 2 every day, we'd wake up far happier to be alive. Let's just take a few of the fundamental ideas. God is so incredibly powerful and awesome, sovereign and good. He created us out of his love. He wanted to be with us. He put us into an earthly habitat that was so overflowing with precious resources, and he gave us the job of creating something wonderful out of them. Talk about great origins. I'm not ignoring the mess that happened with sin. Instead, I'm letting Steve Carber talk about all that tomorrow. I just get all this fun part. But it's really important we start our identity in the genesis of the Bible, that we were created out of love and that God pronounced us very good. The biblical account of creation and the story of man that unfolds throughout the Bible is markedly different from the view of work in Mesopotamia and from the view of work today. The biblical account of creation gives you a healthy perspective on work, without which work will use you. It gives you the concept of the dignity of all work, without which work will bore you. And it gives you hope for work, without which your work will crush you. So here we go, the 3 Ds. God's design for work, the dignity of work, and the destiny of work, or the cultural mandate. God's design for work. Work is so important and so basic that the Bible begins talking about work as soon as it begins talking about anything. He depicts the magnificent project of the cosmos invention within a regular work week of 7 days. Creation is this master plan of a craftsman. He works as an artist, making a masterpiece. He works for the sheer joy of it. Work is exalted. Even before he made humankind work was a magnificent, joyful thing. And then he made us and put us in the garden and gave us a chance to join in this creative project. Working the garden and keeping the garden. We're designed such that work is such a basic human need, is as much a basic human need as food, beauty, rest, friendship, prayer, sexuality. It's food for our soul. Without meaningful work, we sense significant inner loss and emptiness. Now I'm thinking at this point in the semester, that last sentence may not be resonating with you at all. Without meaningful work, we sense significant inner loss and emptiness. So maybe you're thinking, I can't wait till this semester is over and I'm home on Christmas holiday and I can just do nothing for weeks on end. I'm designed to play. Work isn't good for me. But the data, like the Bible, proves you wrong. We're made to work, and we do suffer a loss of our very humanness if we're not. I'm at the age where my friends are retiring, and for some, the dream their entire life has been to stop working and play golf every day. But the data shows that a workless life, even in retirement, leads to depression, illness, and even earlier death. Our country develops job training programs for people, but not just so we don't have to keep them on the welfare rolls, but because work is so essential to life that the people in our society are more peaceful and healthy when its people are working. This truth is evident not just in this country, but around the world and for all time. Some nations have risen and some nations have fallen because of healthy or unhealthy approaches to work. That's how important it is. This truth is also evident for people with far less productive capacity than those of us in this room. I have friends in Philadelphia, Jay and Barbara Belding, who started a business to employ developmentally disabled adults. Jay had been a special ed teacher who kept in touch with his students after they completed high school. And he noticed that they often declined rapidly in functioning and happiness, largely because they didn't have anything meaningful to do. In 1977, Jay and Barbara established Associate Production Services to provide quality training and employment for this population. Today, they employ more than 500 workers at 4 facilities, and they're engaged in a variety of labor-intensive packaging and assembly work for consumer products. Jay's very, very inventive, and he created tools that would help them be able to use machines that they otherwise couldn't have used, and processes that would make it easier for them to understand their part of this assembly line or this workplace. The company's productive and efficient, and his employees feel positive about themselves as they contribute to their company and its customers. They earn a paycheck that enables them to pay for some of the expenses in their life, and they're now able to respond to this vital aspect of their design as workers and creators. So this applies to all kinds of people, all times, all places. So enjoy your holiday break, but keep in mind that you've been designed to work. As a matter of fact, it's so foundational to your makeup that it's one of the few things that you can take in significant doses without it doing harm to you. The 10 Commandments echo this pattern in the creation story where God worked 6 days and then rested on the 7th day. You know the commandment, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Leisure and pleasure are great, but significant doses of them can actually be harmful to you. You get bored, you lose purpose and meaning, and even your pleasure out of pleasure activities starts to diminish. Work is one of the ways we make ourselves useful to others. It's one of the ways we discover who we are, and it's one of the ways we offer ourselves to God. One of my favorite writers on the subject is Dorothy Sayers, who wrote in the mid-1900s. And she says, work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but the thing one lives to do. That's pretty countercultural today. I said earlier, we need to understand God's design for work, or work will use you. What do I mean by that? In our culture today, productivity is paramount, and motivation is spurred on by fear or by idols of prestige and idols of wealth. We can become subject to our work or even victims of our work. We can have contributed in wonderful ways on our last project, but our boss and our colleagues seem to be always saying, yes, but what have you done for us lately? It enslaves us, it can own us, it can use us. The only way to avoid that is to recover God's design and purposes for our work and to remember we're made to work for Him. And we're also given limits: sundown, Sabbath rest. You need to understand God's design for work, or it will use you. Now, second, I'd like to talk about the dignity of work. For the folks in the Beldings factory, work is a mark of their human dignity. God made us in his image, and that's the basis of our dignity. That's what distinguishes us from all other life forms. The biblical view of work as a mark of human dignity is not only different from the ancient creation stories, it's different from Greek philosophy that's permeated our culture to this day. The Greeks understood that life in the world required work, but they believed not all work was equal. Work that used the mind rather than the body was more noble. It was less like the beasts. The entire Greek social structure helped to support this outlook because it rested on the premise that slaves and craftsmen, which weren't much higher than slaves, did all the work, enabling the elite to devote themselves to the exercise of the mind in art, philosophy, and politics. Aristotle famously said, some people are born to be slaves. While we wouldn't say anything like that today, that kind of thinking does persist in our culture. We pay knowledge workers much more than we pay workers that work with their hands. All too often, knowledge workers show great disdain for people who work with their hands, or service workers that keep their lives going. So our culture persists in this very non-biblical view that lower status or lower paying work is somehow an assault on our dignity. The Bible is totally the opposite from that. I work with lots of young adults in New York City who are working at jobs they're not suited for, or aim at careers that don't fit their gifts because of the promise of prestige or higher wages. There is so much freedom in the biblical perspective that all work has dignity and reflects the image of God, our Creator. I hope some of you will work with your hands, or take up a craft, or care for children, or be willing to serve others out of the dignity of doing work that glorifies God in his creation. Work has dignity because it is something that God does, and because we do it in his place as his representatives. I also said that without it, work will bore you. You're bored with a class when you can't connect it to its larger purpose. Or if you have a job in the library and you're supposed to restack books, you get bored with that job unless you can remember that you're serving your fellow students that would be walking into chaos if you didn't restack their books. The antidote to boredom is meaning and purpose, not another job. So please, ponder the dignity of whatever work you find yourself doing. And that takes me to my third point, the destiny of work. Now, I admit, I have a marketing background, so I use the word destiny because I needed a third D: design, dignity, and destiny. But what I really mean is purpose, or the end goal of our work. So I'm hoping you're really familiar with the verse, Genesis 1:28, but I'm going to read it. God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." That's often called the cultural mandate. It's God's job description to mankind. We're called to fill and subdue the earth. Later on in Genesis 2, it elaborates a little bit more on what that means. It says God put man in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. He made woman to give him someone to join in this project of working in the garden and filling the earth. Part of the filling the earth was their procreation of children, and part of it was creatively doing things with the resources God had given them to build a civilization. God could have just spoken the word and created millions of people in thousands of settlements all at once, but he didn't. He made it our job to develop and build society. I also just want to say something briefly about the word subdue. That word should be taken as stewardship or trusteeship. God owns the world. He's put it under our care to cultivate it. It's definitely not a mandate to treat the world and its resources as though they are ours to use, exploit, and discard as we wish. But the word subdue is still a strong word. It invokes real assertion of our will. Work is needed to bring forth all the riches and potential of the world God has made. And God invites the man and the woman he made into that creative activity. So here's a good definition of work. Rearranging the raw material of God's creation in such a way that it helps the world in general and people in particular to thrive and to flourish. I can tell you just a little about how that's played out in some of the jobs I've had in my life. Right after college, I was an elementary school teacher. It was an extremely creative job. So the creation part of the mandate, purposed to give children the necessary skills and learning to grow into adults who could contribute to the good of their families and society. After that, I worked in the aerospace industry. I was part of the project that developed the Space Shuttle program. We were on a mission, so to speak, to discover and creatively use space to serve mankind and help this world flourish. Then I moved to the private sector and worked in the satellite communications industry and then the internet space. My last company created online learning tools that would bring top-notch management education and leadership education to people who couldn't attend top school MBAs, but needed still to become good leaders. Our lofty purpose, as opposed to the one in our pitches to go public, which was that we needed a lot of revenue, our lofty purpose was to help leaders better steward the human resources that they were called upon to manage. It's very helpful to identify what God's purpose might be for all the fields and occupations that we're considering. Our society, here in this country, in the midst of this most depressing election season, deep sigh, and in the world all around us, our society is in dire need of people who understand God's call to cultivate the amazing resources he's given us and work toward the flourishing for all. So now, finally, let's talk about how you can apply all this to your work in college right now and the work you'll do when you get out. And I look forward to reading that book that Byron pointed out about viewing your time in school studying as you would view a job. Don't create such a demarcation between what you're doing now at school and the job that comes after. Both are work. Both are work you're called to by your caller, God. I want to close with 5 action steps. View your studying as a job, just like you'll have when you graduate. A job that needs to recognize God's design. You do it for the sake of the studying itself, not just for the grades or some future benefit it has for you. View your studying as a job that has dignity. View it as a job that has a purpose in the ongoing cultivation and flourishing of God's world. Number 2, celebrate your origins. This is a practice, a discipline even, that will serve you the rest of your life. Read Genesis 1 and 2. Read Psalm 8. Oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. What is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you've made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with honor and glory. You've given us, dominion over the work of your hands. You've put all things under our feet. Read that, soak in it, understand and appreciate your origins. 3, Reject the world's perspective on work, whether it's a Greek view that manual work is less than human, or whether it's a survival of the fittest view that you need to be at the top of the heap in order to survive. There is so much brokenness in our current cultural attitude about work that interferes with God's plan for your work. God is still in charge, and the brokenness will be redeemed. Reject the world's view, seek the biblical view. 4, build deep and lasting community with each other. Reject the individualism of our contemporary culture. We're not meant to work alone. We've got an individual culture where it's all about me, basically being better than everyone else I'm around. Reject that. God created marriage even before the fall so that man and woman could work together in their cultivation. Later, he instituted the church so that we could build one another up and witness to God's plan and God's redemption together out in the broken world. So I love seeing groups of people who graduate from college seeking to stay together, moving to a new city together, getting jobs in the same town, even living in the same place, sharing missional work and goals, or just staying together annually, getting together annually to share and remind each other of our mutual dignity, design, and purpose. And finally, learn to see glimpses of God at work in all kinds of ways and places. God is here. He's still working in the world. If he hadn't been, everything would have fallen apart a long time before now. But we need to develop the eyes to see. We need to learn to see God in the person that lends a helping hand or has a welcoming smile to us or forgives a grievance or sacrifices time and talent to serve others. Don't let the pragmatism of our contemporary culture snuff out your sense of the magnificence and providence of the Almighty Creator God. Refresh yourself in nature. You've got an opportunity to do that more than anyone else. Refresh yourself in worship. Refresh yourself in art. These are some of the ways we can transcend the immediacy of our contemporary world. We were made to work, and it was good. So let me pray for you. Lord, I pray that you will bless the work of all of us here. Keep us faithful and use us to bring shalom wherever you have us at any point in time. In your Son's name, amen. Thank you very much. Great.
Can we move the podium? No, I got it. Got it?
Okay.
Okay. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Are you ready?
You texting questions?
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
That was really, really fantastic. And honestly, I'm so stimulated. We could talk for 2 or 3 hours. You've laid so much on the table. And I'm going to invite your questions. I've got a handful of questions I want to ask you and start with. Most of the questions I want to ask you are very practical in nature, but I want to start with one that's a little more theological, a little more kind of philosophical, theological. Talk to us about, if you might and can, your view of work before the fall and after the fall, and the contrast between them.
Yeah, I love the expression in Genesis 3 that your work after the fall is full of thorns and thistles. And we all have thorns and thistles in our work almost every day and much good parts of every day. So we can get so bogged down by the thorns and thistles in our work that it's hard sometimes to remember it wasn't meant to be that way. So yes, the fall, the separation from God, the brokenness of the world made work hard, and I was going to let Steve Garber do all of that conversation. So.
And he will unpack
That's the depressing
much more of that.
part, you know. No, he will unpack that very thoroughly. I mean, I think two things that are really, the way I structure thinking about the thorns and thistles part is the world is broken outside of us. I mean, there's hurricanes, there's earthquakes, there's all kinds of things that are outside of who we are as individuals. But the world is also broken inside of us. So we cause our own problems through our selfishness and our pride in work, but we also are contending with real problems out in the world that are broken, that God promises will be restored in the new kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth.
So obviously, we're not going to experience a pre-fall version of work. No. We're only experiencing a post-fall version of work. Given that we're in the post-fall on this side of heaven era, is all work God's work?
You know, there's probably some work that's just, you know, I mean, the sex trade industry, I mean, there's clearly some work that is so against God's plan for humanity that it's horrible to even think about. I think there's lots of other work that's in the gray zone. God's purposes for it may be good, but it's so messed up that it's hard to find his original purposes that might be good. I mean, I'll take law. Clearly, God talks about law all the time in the Bible. I mean, he set up judges and Solomon to decide, you know, which lady should get the baby. I mean, God's all about the field of law. But so its purpose is great, but its current practice has tons that's really messed up in it. So as we go out into the field of law, for example, our job is to carry with us that original purpose and reclaim it whenever we can and bring the gospel that's got the power for redemption so that we can point to what it really could be.
So other than kind of the obvious examples of the sex trade or drug trafficking where you have very, very talented people actually, I mean, some of the greatest drug dealers in the world, these are extremely talented business men and women, but this is obviously outside of anything redemptive or good. But besides those, we just kind of cast those aside for a moment, would it be your default counsel to these students that in every other work setting, other than what's very clear, that we look for the redemptive element of it, even if it's really hard to find?
Yeah, I do. You know, so most of the people I get, you know, between 25 and 30, they're coming in to talk to me because they hate their job and it's evil and it's horrible and they want to switch jobs. And usually my advice is your next job is going to be horrible and evil. I mean, the world's broken, and so you really need to develop the skills to see glimpses of God at work in the midst of the brokenness. So in general, I would say that it's possible to get glimpses of good work, redemptive work, wherever you are. However, I have a caveat. I worked in high tech a couple decades, but in the late 90s, when you were one or something, in the late 90s, that industry in Silicon Valley was just booming. There was so much money being made. And there were times I thought, I have, to use the biblical expression, I pitched my tent at the gates of hell. You know, the closer you are to extraordinary wealth, the hotter the fire. I don't know how else to describe it. So there were times that I was obsessed with my stock portfolio. I was just I was closer to the temptation than my character could bear. So I do think we have to venture into brokenness with courage, but we also have to be honest about ourselves. The closer you get, especially to making a lot of money or a lot of power or a lot of fame, the more you need people that anchor you you need a community of Christian fellowship that doesn't let you fall into the pit, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's begin to bridge this at a practical level.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the work in Raleigh with the New Fellows program.
So I don't know, you might know there's a bunch of fellows programs that started in Falls Church outside of DC for people right out of college, 1 year out of college. It's like almost a gap year between graduating and going to work. And there must be 20, 25 of them. And they're interesting, and I'm sure your school can guide you to those if you're interested. We couldn't do that in New York, and Raleigh didn't want to do that. So we're doing a program for people after they're established in their career. So 25 to 39. You know, you've been out of school enough by then that you actually want to learn again. So it's a good time. And so we did it 10 years in New York City. And I retired from that, and my husband and I are now in Raleigh starting one there with Holy Trinity Church. Some of you may know it. In downtown Raleigh, we're partnering with 2 other churches. We have 25, it's our first year. We have 25 young people, all different professions. They read theology vigorously. They read Augustine and Luther and Calvin and John Murray. So it's like going to seminary for people who would never go to seminary so that they can be better equipped to be God's ambassadors in the fields that they've been called to. So we're really excited about it.
Started it when?
We launched it this September.
Okay.
So
are you full-time in Raleigh now?
We're a little more than half-time there.
Yeah.
So,
with the migration toward North Carolina, or
no,
we're
just we're like 21-year-olds. We don't really know what we're going to do when we grow up. So we'll see.
Figure it out along the way. So we've got questions. I've got more questions, but we got questions rolling in from our students.
Good.
I'm going to kind of dive into some of those. First one is, how have you found success in the secular world as a Christian?
How
have you found success?
I mean, like, what do I think of it, or how did I get there?
Let's go with how have you handled success?
Badly. I'm a broken person, so it goes to my head. God constantly has to knock me off of my pedestal so that I get humbled again. I firmly believe that God will use us more in our weakness than in our super confident, successful, put on all the airs thing. And yet, we're all tempted to just bask in those moments of success. We're all tempted to pump up our resume beyond what we really deserve. So I've had some wonderful successes, and I've had some horrible failures, and I did the same thing both times. So it was far bigger than me. And I'm grateful that I've gotten to use my gifts, but sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't.
So I do a fair number of interviews over the course of a year on this stage with guests who have given, who have succeeded at some level. And one of the questions I frequently ask is tell us about your biggest failure. So I'm not going to ask you that question now, but I'm curious whether you've learned more through success or failure.
More through failure.
And why? What have you learned through failure?
Well, success, you start to think you did it. And it actually pulls you away from God. Failure, you're like Jacob wrestling with God. So my biggest failure, I was months wrestling with God after that. Like, how can you call me to something and let it fail? I must just be a worm, I can't do anything. I'm just going to go suck worms, I guess is what you suck. But anyway, failure throws you back at God. And that's why you learn more. Success, you just sort of start getting this this picture of yourself, and you become more like a cutout instead of a real person. So I think you grow dramatically more in success. Now, in failure. In failure. Obviously, if you just failed and failed and failed and failed, you wouldn't get an opportunity to do the next failure. So you have to have some mixture there.
How exactly do you use the creation story to reach those in need of learning more about God's Word?
about God and God's Word?
Yeah, I think that in talking to people who are just exposed very little to God or are sort of anti-God, it's a whole lot better to start with a conversation about worldview. You know, what do you think we're here for? How do you think, who made us? Why are we here? What's our purpose in life? And then say, you know, I want to be living into another story, and describe the Bible not as here's the 4 things you need to say to become a Christian, but describe the story of the Bible and say, this is why that means something in my life. So, I mean, what I tried to say tonight, the beginning, the creation part of that story is what gives me my sense of worth. And you guys are the product of the self-esteem generation. You know, you've been told you were great since you were born. And if we just keep telling you you're great, whether you get a good grade or a bad grade, you're somehow magically going to have self-esteem. Well, I don't think that really works any better than any other model. The only source of a self-image that's healthy is that God made you in his image and loves you. And so you're going to need to dig into this story as much as my generation needed to dig into it.
So someone here asked one of the questions that I was wondering about. You talked about our destiny, and you began describing rearranging the raw material of God's creation, and none of us could keep up with what it is, and we wanted to write it down. So what is the full version of that? I have to look up my
note on that, but rearranging the raw materials of God's creation. Let's see. In such a way that it helps the world in general and people in particular to thrive and to flourish.
You want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, it's easy to see when you're building a building. So this beautiful building, it's all products of God's creation, and some amazing architect and some amazing craftsperson did it. I mean, my career has more been rearranging human potential. When you're leading a company of 100 or more people, you're working to make them work well together, to enable them to work well together. And so it's, whether it's people management or raw material management, I think it still applies. And when you're leading, you're leading people to a higher purpose. Whether they believe in God or not, they all need a vision for what their work is pointing to, what the purpose of it is. The death of a company or an organization is when everyone's working for their own gain. It always dies. But if you as a leader can mobilize people to work for some higher good, whether it's a customer or whether it's to make a beautiful building or it's to save a forest, whatever it might be, that's what breeds good work.
So not that the other questions aren't theological, but here's a more kind of direct theological question.
Okay.
You said in your talk that sin is not part of God's plan.
You're going to ask me a question theologians throughout the ages can't answer.
Can you please elaborate on your view? Specifically, how did sin come about outside of God's plan? Isn't God all-knowing and should have put sin in his plan?
I'm going to punt. I'm just going with the story. But Steve Garber could talk to you for 4 hours on that subject.
Okay, so we'll ask Steve tomorrow.
Please ask Steve and tell him I punted.
All right.
Steve's been a mentor of mine, and he never explained it so I could understand it, so I can't tell you.
Do you have any advice?
Is Steve here? He's supposed to be here soon.
Is Steve here? He's not here yet, no. We'll surprise him. So, do you have any advice for an aspiring biologist when it comes to getting the most out of every day at work?
specifically biologist, no.
Or a scientist.
A scientist, yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm going to give you as full an answer as you might want, but let me say two things. One is a biologist or a scientist, I worked with scientists, different kind in the aerospace world, and it was one of the most positive environments that I ever worked in, and most of them were not Christian, but they did live in an awe of the research and the work they were doing to unfold the way the world works, or the mysteries of creation would be my language. So people in the sciences are often more positive because they're enthralled in some way. So that's one thing I would say. I would say to someone going into biology that you're facing some of the more ethical issues that the world has ever seen. And so it will take a lot of study, I think. This area in North Carolina has got some of the top thinkers in how we should apply what we're learning about in genome research and other things to the world today. We met with the Secretary of Health and Human Services for the state of North Carolina a couple weeks ago with our Fellows program. And I mean, he's a brilliant, thoughtful Christian man who would talk to students interested in science and give you sort of a program on how to become informed thoroughly enough in both your faith and your science so that you can be a thought leader in that area. We need you.
Biologists and scientists more broadly are really, they're at the front line.
Yes.
The bioethical issues of this day are some of the most consequential issues of all of life.
That's right. Whether it's in warfare, whether it's in healing, whether it's in reproducing life, yes.
What was your work in marketing like for an online company?
I did marketing for a whole range of technology companies, so from hardware and software to
Hey, could I just ask
internet.
us to keep the chatter down, please? Thank you.
To internet, and I did business-to-business marketing as opposed to business-to-consumer marketing. I did not like business-to-consumer marketing. Some of you may love that part. Business-to-business marketing, you're more explaining the benefits of your product and how it's going to really make a tangible difference in how they're doing their work or doing their job. So it was more like case studies and explaining the benefits than it was doing a creative design that would capture people's attention and have you sing their logo forever, which I don't in any way put down. That was not my gift.
How can we keep our work skills intact so that when we're on a break, we don't lose sight of the importance of work?
I think that you've got rhythms of work and rest that are not sustainable. Working like solid for 2 months and then not at all for a month is not like sort of a normal pattern of life. So I would think on the time when you're working intensely, just try a little bit harder for rhythms, like a good portion of a Sabbath and really use it as a Sabbath, or hours of sleep, be a little bit more diligent in that. But then on the holiday time, when we're talking about work, it could be other kinds of work. You could do a little bit of reading every day during that time. You could do work around your parents' house. There's things you could do during those days that serve and that help you experience the act of working for God's benefit for God's purposes, even if it's only an hour or two of the day during a holiday.
You use this language of rhythm a few times, including in this
Yeah.
answer. There really is a rhythm to life, and there's a rhythm to work and rest, work and play. We are built for rhythm.
Yeah.
And I know that when I can tell when I'm out of rhythm, and it's really, I'm off, and if I don't pay attention to whether I'm in rhythm or out of rhythm, I can get badly out of rhythm if I'm not careful.
Yeah.
That's something I'm guessing that you've seen over and over again in your work experience.
Yeah, and you guys are sort of the fitness generation. So I would assume everyone who does a daily workout completely gets that from the exercise perspective. Just apply that also to rhythms of work and to sleep and worship.
What elements make up a great workplace where people thrive? What characteristics should we look for when we're discerning a company or organization to work for?
That's great. That's a great question. I was told when I got out of business school that I would be better off to go to work for a good leader than worry about the kind of work it was. Pick your boss if you can, as opposed to the nature of the work. Now, I don't think that has to apply in all cases, but it made me think that even the best work can be ruined by a horrible environment. So try to pay attention to that. From my perspective, in shaping the culture of companies, one, to try to push the work down. So a really hierarchical organization where, you're at the bottom and you're just like going through the little rat wheel doing something that you don't know the purpose of, it tends to be fairly unhealthy. But an organization that's flatter, that you're actually getting to make some decisions during the course of your work, is going to be a lot healthier culture. Similarly, sort of respecting the human dignity of other people. In my companies, the engineers always hated the marketing people, and everyone hated the sales people, and nobody respected the human resources people. And trying to discern in interviews if you're hearing respect or enjoyment of people across their disciplines is, I think, something that would give you a real clue. And companies that are thriving are usually more joyful places, but companies that are struggling have more opportunity. So if you could find a good situation or a good leader in a company that needs or an organization, not just a school, a nonprofit, that needs a little bit of a turnaround, that tends to provide more opportunity for you to insert yourself earlier in the career stage.
There's an element of creativity in those situations that more successful kind of the machine's already built companies don't have.
Yeah, I always worked in startups, except for one company. It was a large telecom company, and that made me very grateful for my startup company experience. So just because of that, you get more to do more.
So here's another really great question, completely different vein. I was raised in a family where my mom was a stay-at-home mom and didn't have a job outside the home. How does she fit into this idea of work without having a career? And I think behind the question is it less valuable for a male or a female to stay home to raise children as part of this concept of work and vocation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, our culture is really shifted on the extreme of not valuing stay-at-home moms. So I hear tons of women or men that feel that disdain from people who are in a paid job somewhere out there, and that's just wrong in God's picture of work. So you heard in Genesis 1:28, we were called to both procreate and cultivate in the world at large, and both of the jobs are important. Sometimes it's easier for a woman to stay home and do that than a man, but not always. So I would encourage us as the body of Christ to celebrate both, not be judgmental about women who go to work, and not, if we're working, be judgmental about women who stay home.
Historically, culture has placed a fractured perspective of work for men and women. Men are told to do one type of work and women another. Our culture is shifting in that view. How does Genesis speak into work in regard to this issue that is changing in the current day?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly competing views for what Genesis has to say about women's roles with respect to men's roles, and I don't want to dive into that too much, but I think it's pretty clear that when God said Adam needed a helpmate, it was to go out and cultivate and multiply in this world. So we were given the same task to do together. It's only in since we've had an industrial society, that men and women have been so separated during their work. You know, they were on the farm together, maybe doing a little bit different kind of work, but they weren't, like the guy wasn't gone all day and the woman stuck at home. It was a team thing. So I'd love us to be more, like missionaries are called together, male and female. And you know, I don't know how many missionaries you know, but I've been in awe of some of those marriages and some of those families because they're in the field together. We're getting to work together, my husband and I, and we've only been married 6 years, so I'm a newlywed. But we're getting to work together. I don't want it any other way. It's so wonderful to be able to be called together. So some of the brokenness in our world, I think, is that it splits us up. And we come home at night and can't relate to each other's days at all. And so finding more ways that we can serve together, I think is healthy all the way around.
So we're at the end of our time. We've got a number of other questions. I think they've appreciated this time. I actually have one other question that I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to give you kind of a final word before we dismiss. So the last question, hang tight. Last question of a long series of questions. What is your number one piece of advice in choosing direction for career in light of our greater purpose? And then I'm going to give you, after you answer that, kind of any final word that you want to offer.
My number one general piece of advice, because it might be different to certain individuals, but across the board would be try to get a job that you'll learn the most from when you get out. And don't sweat whether it's the career or the job that you need to be in forever. You've got some time to make switches. Just try to go learn as much as you can in the working world somewhere. Don't take the easiest job. Take the one that's going to push you the hardest. And I'm really impressed that you guys are doing this. So thank you. You've got an amazing week ahead, and I'm honored to be part of it. So
please thank me and to join me in thanking Catherine and Larry also. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of quick announcements and some reminders, right? So announcements are, so the bookstore is officially open, so down the hallway in Fellowship Hall, please check it out. Tonight we will be showing in its entirety For the Life of the World, the video series. Evan Coons, we've used in IS 102. It's open to anyone who'd want to. We'll be in Morgan 110. We'll be watching that. But I do have some news about Evan. Evan's father is ill, and he believes that he's close to passing, so Evan didn't feel like he could travel during this time. So that's why we've talked about, we'll give Steve Garber a chance to answer some of these questions. We're grateful that Steve has is stepped up to offer his services during those times tomorrow morning. So we'll hear Steve tomorrow morning at 10:30. The last announcement, we'll start in the morning with a workshop at 9 o'clock. Look at the app. Look at the program book on your way out. Make some good choices. We'll see you then. Take your time on the way out. Chat with each other because we'll scan on the way out. Thank you so much.
I could just sit and wait for all your goodness, hope to feel your presence, and I could just stay